Rome, the year 1502. A city draped in silk and shadow. Inside the Vatican, gold flickers under torchlight, and laughter hides the sound of daggers drawn in secret. Tonight, a wedding unites two dynasties, but in truth, it is a battlefield disguised as a feast. The bride, Lucrezia Borgia, young, beautiful, but no innocent. Daughter of a pope, sister to a warlord and a woman already scarred by betrayal and blood. Twice married, twice discarded, her very name carries whispers of poison, scandal, and death. But what awaits her tonight is unlike anything before. When the songs fade and the goblets empty, her wedding bed will not be private. Curtains will be drawn back. Priests, ambassadors, and noblemen will stand as witnesses. They will watch as her body is turned into proof, as her most intimate moment is weaponized for politics. And it will not happen once, not twice, but 3 times until no doubt, no rumor, no question remains. A union sealed in flesh under the gaze of strangers, a night meant to humiliate, but destined to change the fate of a duchess, a dynasty, and perhaps all of Italy. What happens when love becomes theater? When power demands an audience, and when survival itself is forged in the fires of shame? To understand that night, we must step back. Italy in the year 1500 was not one united country, but a chessboard of rival city-states. Milan, Venice, Florence, and Naples, each one a glittering jewel, each one ruled by families who smiled at the banquet table and poisoned each other in the dark. Every marriage, every alliance, every whispered promise carried the weight of war. At the center of this storm stood Rome, not only the holy city of Christendom, but also the most dangerous court in Europe. And ruling it was not a saintly shepherd, but a family whose very name had become a warning: the Borgias. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, a man who bought his papal crown with gold and blood. Beside him his son Cesare Borgia, a warlord with charm as sharp as his blade, feared by princes and peasants alike. And then Lucrezia, the Pope's daughter. Beautiful, intelligent, and endlessly useful. For them. From the moment she was of age, Lucrezia was not treated as a daughter, but as a weapon. Her first marriage, annulled, her husband publicly shamed as impotent, humiliated before all of Italy. Her second, a match of love, rare in her world. But love meant nothing to her brother. One night her husband was dragged from his chamber, stabbed and strangled on the Vatican steps. His crime? He was no longer useful. By 1502, Lucrezia Borgia was only 22, but already twice betrayed, twice discarded, twice reduced to whispers in the mouths of enemies. And yet she endured. For her father and brother, she was still their most valuable pawn. Now came the third marriage. Not just a union, but a gamble for survival. The Borgias needed the power and prestige of Ferrara, one of Italy's oldest and proudest duchies. But the Este family of Ferrara despised them. They saw the Borgias as upstarts drenched in scandal and corruption. They demanded proof, certainty, a guarantee that this marriage was real and could not be undone. The stakes could not have been higher. For Lucrezia, this was no ordinary wedding. It was her last chance to shed the shadow of humiliation and step into a role that could either destroy her completely or make her untouchable. The halls of Ferrara shimmered that night with a splendor meant to dazzle. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, golden pheasants, and sugared fruits carved into impossible shapes. Goblets overflowed with sweet wine, and the air was thick with the perfume of roses, incense, and power. Poets stood and recited verses of love, musicians played lutes and viols, and dancers spun in silks beneath chandeliers of flame. For a moment it seemed like a fairy tale, but fairy tales in Italy were masks, and behind every smile lurked suspicion. The Este family, proud lords of Ferrara, sat at the head of the table, watching their new daughter-in-law with cold, measuring eyes. They knew the Borgia reputation too well. Poisoners, schemers, masters of deception. To them, this wedding was not a union but a risk, and they would not allow their heir to be humiliated or destroyed like Lucrezia's previous husbands. Not this time, so they made a demand as grotesque as it was logical in their world. The marriage, they said, must not only be celebrated, it must be proven. The consummation, the very act of intimacy between bride and groom, would not be private. It would be witnessed, certified, recorded. Only then could Ferrara trust that the Borgias would not twist the union to their advantage with whispers of impotence or lies of annulment. As dancers twirled and jesters performed, most of the guests drank and laughed, oblivious. But behind the laughter, behind the music, another stage was being prepared. A bridal chamber not hidden but arranged like a theater. Curtains set just so, a bed positioned for view. A handful of witnesses selected. Este envoys, papal clerics, men who would watch with eyes sharp and faces solemn. Notaries of the flesh, guardians of political certainty. Lucrezia knew. She smiled at her guests, lifted her jeweled goblet and played the perfect bride. But every glance, every whispered cheer, only pulled her closer to the humiliation waiting behind the curtains. And as the feasting roared louder, as the candles burned lower, everyone in that golden hall knew the true performance of the night had not yet begun. The chamber was no bridal sanctuary. It was a stage, a velvet-draped theater where intimacy was stripped of tenderness and reshaped into performance. The bed stood at the center, gilded, ceremonial, framed by heavy curtains left just slightly open. Enough for eyes to pierce the darkness, but not enough for the bride and groom to hide. One by one, the witnesses entered, Este envoys in stiff collars, papal clerics with cold eyes, notaries clutching their quills. They stood in silence, their presence suffocating, their faces half averted but their gaze unflinching. In that suffocating stillness, Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of a pope, Duchess-to-be, ceased to be a woman. She became a contract, a body reduced to proof, a pawn performing her duty under the weight of history's gaze. The first act began. The silence shattered into whispers. Some muttered prayers, others coughed into their sleeves, embarrassed, unsettled. But the news traveled quickly. Ferrara had its proof. The marriage was sealed. And yet, doubt lingered. Too many rumors, too many enemies. The Este family wanted certainty that could not be undone by gossip, so it was done again. A second act. This time there was no mistaking the humiliation. Whispers grew louder, more vicious. The bride who once sparkled beneath chandeliers was now reduced to flesh and politics, her privacy consumed by the hunger of power. The spectacle rippled through the palace. Servants whispered, guests speculated. The night of celebration was now a night of scandal, but even this was not enough. To erase every shadow of doubt, the ritual was demanded a third time. The witnesses leaned forward, their eyes sharp, their quills scratching on parchment as though the act itself could be notarized, sealed, and filed like a treaty. 3 times in one night, a woman's body was transformed into a public ledger. 3 times the marriage was recorded in flesh, witnessed and certified. 3 times humiliation became law. And with the third act, the contract was complete. For Ferrara, it was certainty. For the Borgias, it was survival. But for Lucrezia, it was something else entirely. A lesson carved into her very soul. That power and shame are twin weapons, and the one forced to endure can learn to wield them both. For most women, that night would have broken them. But Lucrezia Borgia was not most women. She did not crumble beneath the weight of humiliation. Instead, she gathered its ashes and forged them into armor. By enduring what no one else could, she had secured her place beyond all doubt. The Este family could never question her marriage now. Rome could never whisper annulment, and the world could never call her illegitimate. The grotesque trial had given her something priceless: permanence. When she entered Ferrara as Duchess, she was no longer the pawn of her father or brother. She was iron, veiled in silk. In public, she embodied grace and piety, kneeling at altars, sponsoring charities, earning the devotion of priests. But behind palace doors, her true power began to grow. She built salons where poets, philosophers, and musicians gathered, their words weaving a court culture that made Ferrara glitter across Italy. Artists painted her image, scholars dedicated works to her name. The same city that once doubted her now celebrated her as its jewel. Every verse written, every fresco unveiled became another stone in the fortress of her reputation. Yet Lucrezia's transformation was more than culture. It was strategy. She listened carefully in these gatherings, noting alliances, nurturing loyalties, and weaving networks that made her indispensable. Nobles who once scoffed at her became allies. Ambassadors who dismissed her now feared her sharp intellect. The pawn had become a strategist. The woman humiliated in bedchambers now presided over courts with quiet authority. Every rumor endured in her past became another tool she could wield. Every scar another reason for others to underestimate her. And that was their mistake. By surviving, Lucrezia did more than endure. She conquered. She turned shame into legitimacy, spectacle into permanence, and humiliation into the foundation of power. Years passed, and with time, the whispers of that grotesque wedding night began to fade. In their place, a new title emerged. Not pawn, not the Pope's daughter, but something few could have imagined. The good Duchess. When her husband rode to war or sat in councils far from Ferrara, it was Lucrezia who ruled. She signed decrees, managed finances, listened to petitions. Farmers brought her their grievances. Merchants sought her approval. And slowly, the people began to see her not as a victim but as their protector. The woman once humiliated before nobles now became the symbol of stability. Streets prospered under her governance. Churches flourished with her patronage. And artists immortalized her in frescoes that still survive. She was no longer the scandal of Rome, she was the pride of Ferrara. But history is never simple. Scholars, even centuries later, argue about her. Was Lucrezia Borgia merely enduring a nightmare forced upon her? Or was she cunning enough to turn it into her stepping stone? Did she bend to the cruelty of her family and her enemies? Or did she secretly guide her own ascent? Her story resists a single answer. Victim or mastermind? Trapped pawn or hidden strategist? Perhaps she was both, one of fragile and resilient, manipulated yet manipulative, shamed yet unbroken. And it was this paradox that made her unforgettable. And so history leaves us with a paradox. What was meant to shame her became her weapon. What was designed to cage her built her throne. That wedding bed was never just a bed. It was a battlefield, and Lucrezia Borgia, forced into humiliation, turned it into the foundation of a dynasty. Perhaps this is the true lesson. Power is never only about swords or crowns. Sometimes it is about survival, about taking the very chains meant to bind you and forging them into armor. But here is the haunting question. If power always needs an audience, who is the real prisoner? The one on stage or the crowd that cannot look away?